Welcome. This is our fifth in our series of net inclusion. For 2021, we turned it into a webinar series and it's working out fabulously. We have 9 webinars total. We started out with 8 and then a really important topic came up. So now we have 9. This is our fifth and we are thrilled to be doing this with you all. So today what we're going to talk about is the fact that during the pandemic, organizations who hadn't been doing digital inclusion work all of a sudden ended up doing digital inclusion work. That folks who had been doing other programming realized during the pandemic that they couldn't do that programming unless they then adjusted and added to their programming digital inclusion. So they had to help their clients learn how to use the internet and have a connection to the internet and have the right computer device. And that all, of course, is time consuming and requires not only staff, but resources. So our folks today are going to get into the fact of how you merge that digital inclusion work into other work, right? Your mission may have nothing to do with technology, but you can't accomplish that mission unless you're also addressing technology. So welcome to everyone. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and we do record these. So if you miss some or you want to share it, it will be on the website sometimes later that day, sometimes tomorrow, but very quickly as soon as we can get it up. So I'm going to hand it over to Liana, and she is going to tell us about this awesome panel. Liana, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am super honored to be here. I am really excited about this topic. Weaving digital inclusion into existing programs is something I'm super passionate about. So I'm Liana Mays-Lena. I'm the Senior Program Manager at N10. N10 is an organization that supports nonprofits in using technology more effectively to meet their missions. And my work at N10 is managing our Digital Inclusion Fellowship, which perhaps some of you have heard of. And in the context of the Digital Inclusion Fellowship, some of you may have seen on the listserv that we just announced that we are opening applications for the 7th cohort. So I invite you all to check out the link. Thank you, Sean, I think, or Paulo, who just dropped the link into the chat. The fellowship is a program that supports nonprofit professionals in building and expanding digital inclusion programs in their communities. And we provide project planning, coaching, mentorship, all kinds of support along the way. So we currently have 11 positions across the US. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, check out the link. Thanks to the support and sponsorship of Google Fiber and the Cleveland Foundation, it's free for folks to apply and participate. So if you have any questions about it, you are, of course, welcome to also email me. So over the last 6 or so years of the Digital Inclusion Fellowship, something that has become abundantly clear to us in working with nearly 80 fellows across the US is that the organizations that tend to have the most powerful impact and the programs that are the most sustainable and replicable are the programs where digital inclusion is truly like woven into the fabric of already existing programming. So lots of organizations can launch basic digital inclusion classes or computer literacy class, and all of that is super helpful and important and useful. But sometimes those kinds of approaches are not sustainable because they have not been incorporated into the strategic vision of the organization, and they don't always feel mission aligned. So they end up being standalone, they end up being siloed, and then as time goes by, they sort of just drop off and are forgotten about. And so what we've seen is that a lot of that alignment that's created between looking at the vision of your organization and the mission and then digital inclusion is created by asking some questions around the gaps that you might be seeing. So for example, for a workforce development organization, it might be asking the question of, what does it mean when our clients can't actually sign up for our workforce development classes because they don't have access at home? Or if it's an education-focused organization, what are the implications if our students don't have computers at home to type up their homework? Or maybe for a healthcare provider, that question is, what does it mean if our patients can't even access their medical records online? So for all of those different kinds of organizations, as Angela was saying, that might not have been doing digital inclusion work and that didn't feel really connected to their work, COVID has for many of them made it really apparent that they need to be doing that work. And so I think that when we take the time to consider how digital access and skills gaps are affecting the services we provide, we realize that digital inclusion or digital equity is not just the domain of traditional digital inclusion organizations anymore. So all of us, no matter our organization's focus, and no matter if we're doing adult literacy or healthcare or environmental stewardship, whatever that might be, can and should be integrating digital inclusion into that work so that we can have some really powerful programs, create lots of impact in our communities, and make sure that those programs are really sustainable long term. So I am, again, really honored to be here and to have this group of panelists who have been doing this work and who are going to be sharing some of the lessons that they've learned. So to start the conversation, I'd love to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And in addition to your name and organization, if you could also briefly tell us about your relationship to digital equity and inclusion. So let's start with Essay.
Thank you, Leanna, and thank you both to NDIA and N10 for hosting this. I'm so happy to be a part of the community here. I am a newbie to digital equity. Relatively speaking, I've been engaged in this work for about a year. My background is in social work, mental health, policy research, and refugee resettlement. I'm currently a senior policy analyst with the Migration Policy Institute. It's a research institute or think tank that looks at immigration, migration, and integration. And certainly we've learned a lot over the last year about how essential digital access and skills development are for refugees to successfully resettle in the US.
Thanks. I'll pass it over to Autumn.
Good afternoon. I'm so excited to be with this panel of new friends and to be with the audience. My name is Autumn Glover. I'm an urban planner by training. I work for The Ohio State University in a dual role. So for the university, I lead civic and community engagement, partnerships, and projects for our Wexner Medical Center and our health sciences colleges. But I'm also president of our nonprofit affiliate. And so I really am a community developer at heart. And that's really where my work in digital equity has been born. Like SA, I just started doing this work about a year ago. I think the pandemic awakened in us an opportunity to really think about how we do business and do it well for the people we serve, leveraging the internet. So very excited to talk with all of you.
Great. How about Christy?
Good morning. I'm also thankful to be part of this panel and part of this webinar today. I'm Christy Nellermo. I'm the Education Program Supervisor at the International Rescue Committee in the Salt Lake City office, also working with refugee and new American populations, specifically in refugee resettlement. And I oversee youth programming and digital inclusion programming at IRC. And I was also an N10 Digital Inclusion Fellow in 2019. So that was an incredible experience where really catapulted a lot of our programming into the next level with all the support and connections through that great opportunity. So I know it's in the link, but just another shout out for applying to that fellowship. Thank you, Leanna.
Thanks. I'll always take another shout out for the fellowship. And then Kate, let's see if Kate's audio is working.
This is Kate Harkin. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
This is Kate. You can hear me. Okay. I'm with Vantage Aging Senior Community Service Employment Program, and we do workforce for low-income individuals 55 and over.
I'm going to jump in. I think maybe Kate's audio dropped, but perhaps we can bring her in a little bit later.
I'm sorry.
Ooh.
Has it come through the space landing? This is through your state park system. So my name is Kate Harkin. I'm with Vantage Aging, and we're a nonprofit organization focused on positive aging. And I oversee the Senior Community Service Employment Program, which is workforce development for low-income people 55 and older.
Great. I think we got most of that. Thanks, Kate. So as both Angela and I were introing this topic of conversation, a big part of what we've noticed is that pre-COVID, a lot of organizations were not doing digital inclusion work, and it was truly the pandemic that pushed them into that space. So some of the organizations represented on this panel also, as the panelists were sharing, were not doing explicit digital inclusion work pre-pandemic. So I'd love to ask you all, which aspects of your existing programming did you find needing an infusion of digital inclusion support? So basically, where were those digital to address? Let's start with Kate, if your audio is still working.
Hi, this is Kate again. I wanted to check and see if we're, sorry for the, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
So actually the workforce development program that we didn't plan on digital inclusion at all, quite frankly. We've really relied on the third space network of libraries, workforce development centers, community centers that provide access to computers and training and those type of activities that helped our workforce learner gain new skills and also have access. The pandemic brought about the complete collapse of those not only systems and access to those systems, but it also surfaced an underlying assumption that learners would have access to this large work, making it possible that they could get the training. My program actually is a paid job training program. So when training was unavailable, that stopped family income. That meant that people working, we are at 125% or below of the poverty line for eligibility. And what that means on a weekly basis is that an individual home, one person, that's $310 a week. Our wages represented $176 a week. So when someone was in training, they weren't receiving wages of, over 55%. So our digital inclusion entree into the world is almost an emergency in terms of family safety, security, income, and we pay cash wages. So it was really necessity, kind of the mother of invention. We had to figure a workaround plan, and we reached out immediately to NDIA.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think that, necessity being the mother of invention is the truth for a lot of us on this call. Let's pass it over to SAA to hear about how you all identified existing gaps.
Yeah, it's really helpful to reflect on this question because we've been on the go, go, go for so long. It's nice to pause and reflect. Similar to what Karen was just saying, we were doing our work as usual, and our work as context is technical assistance in addition to research and policy recommendations. So in the technical assistance arm, MPI led a policy academy of 10 states. And we were helping those states to implement 2 generational strategies for refugee resettlement services. And it focused on things like better job strategies, strengthening services to youth, encouraging early childhood development. But once the pandemic hit, those were not the topic areas that our colleagues in the Policy Academy were focused on. And in fact, they weren't the topics that we were focused on because we were trying to figure out Zoom and Teams and SharePoint and everything else. So we had to adjust. And then to add another layer to it, we also responded to the racial justice movement that was sparked by the murder of George Floyd. And so we began to look a lot more at equity. We engaged those 10 states in discussions and reports around what does your work look like now? How can the Policy Academy be of support now? And based on that work, we decided to shift gears to digital equity as a part of our focus areas. we convened with the support of NDIA a virtual discussion around digital equity as kind of a 101 primer for our participants. And then a handful of states got one-on-one technical assistance that lasted a few months. And then on top of that, we dove deeper into the subject of digital equity with a new mixed method study that we're currently engaged in.
Yeah, I love that you asked that question of what does your work look like now, and we're able to be so responsive and truly address what that new scope of work look like. So Autumn, I'm curious if it was similar at all for you and your work.
So I think what got us engaged, I would say, as a local community. So I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, and Central Ohio. Our work really started as a community around education. But for me personally, thinking about the work I do on the Near East side of Columbus, so I'm serving an 800-acre neighborhood. I'm a planner. Sorry if acres mean nothing to you, but a pretty large urban neighborhood. And our work in this space really was introduced because we were planning to host a series of workforce development events. And as we were trying to plan those events, where initially they were designed to be in person, as we kept trying to get over the hurdle of, what a pandemic and a stay-at-home order meant, we eventually had to cancel because we could not cross what I have described as this Red Sea of digital exclusion for our neighborhood. Now, as a leader in this space and having led in this community for 10 years, I felt incredible shame. How had I missed this? And as was previously mentioned, our community largely relied on third places, Starbucks, using their cell phones. We have a wonderful library system here in Central Ohio, and particularly in our neighborhood, a great library. And so when we would ask people, do you have access to the internet? Do you use email? Prior to the pandemic, they could say yes, because they were leveraging these resources. But in a moment where everyone had to stay home, there was nothing. And so I really stayed top of mind that I was thinking about adults and families, which was kind of the opposite of what our larger community conversation was. Our community conversation was about K-12. And so really trying to explore, how do we solve this problem? And I'm someone who, I was raised to do it right the first time and you won't have to do it again. And I really felt like for us as an organization focused in one neighborhood, what we brought to this problem was a deep knowledge of our people and our place. And so the way that we really do all of our work is leading with community engagement. So we hired people in the community, sent them out with PPE to go door to door to really learn what was actually happening. So we knew we couldn't have these events. We knew there was large media, both locally and nationally, around K-12 gaps. So we really wanted to understand what was happening in our neighborhood. So about 7,500 residents total. Within a month's time, we talked to 300 of them. And what we really learned is that people didn't have the internet because they couldn't afford it. And so while we were trying to host this one event and get people access, we suddenly were opened into this whole wide world of what does it actually mean to be digitally included? And affordability was our largest problem, but we didn't then learn that it's affordability, it's access to devices, and then it's also the skills to leverage those resources. And our approach then began to do all of those three things. Again, do it right the first time. You don't have to do it again. And we had a captive audience of people that we knew. We really know our community very well. And so I think when I think about this work and kind of where we've been in a year, what I've learned most is that neighborhood-based organizations, those trusted brokers, are really an important element to this work. So our work was first starting with what we did know, what we knew about our people, and then going out and connecting with organizations like NDIA, our library system. Here in Columbus, we launched the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition as a result of what we were all learning collectively. So it's hard to believe it's only been a year. I feel like I've been working in this space for 10 years. This stuff maybe ages you a bit, but very privileged that we could leverage the knowledge of these community-based organizations in Columbus to really make a difference.
Yeah, and I want to touch on two things that you brought up. I think I'm so glad that you brought up that word shame. I feel like this sector has so much of that, whether it's shame of not having internet access at home, or it's the shame of not knowing about digital distressed neighborhoods or not knowing about the digital divide, and how I feel like having conversations like this is so helpful because we can let go of that and we can focus on moving forward and finding those solutions. And I appreciate also you bringing up the trusted brokers and the relationships and leaning on organizations that have been doing this work. And, you know, we'll get more into that later on, because those relationships are so key to partnering and to really having like a full inclusive approach to digital equity. So I'm going to take it back to SA. I know you already mentioned a little bit of not only the gaps that you identified, but also how you started addressing those gaps, how you became really responsive to the needs around digital equity and digital inclusion. So I'm curious, you know, once that process started, how did you weave digital inclusion concepts, whether access or skills or affordability or any of that, into your already existing programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So in large part, it's been through the Policy Academy that I referenced, but then we've also broached it in terms of new work that we're engaging in. When it comes to the Policy Academy, we provided a training for everyone and then dove deeply with 3 states, Arizona, Maryland, and Texas. And for those states, we worked with them on, you know, the 3 legs of the stool, and tailored the work that we did with them to their needs. And we actually partnered with NDIA on this as well. So for example, in Arizona, we partnered with the local library and even state library in order to map where refugees live and where broadband is available and the quality of the broadband, so that, you know, the state and other partners could identify where the gaps are, and they could work with funders, philanthropic community, and others to support where those gaps are. And by the 3 legs of the stool, I mean training, access to devices, and broadband or internet. And then in Maryland, we actually partnered with different refurbishers and got 70+ computers and other devices to refugee households in Baltimore and PG County or Prince George's County. And then in Texas, we helped them work on requests for funding proposals so that they could partner with their local contacts and provide training not only to refugee communities, ethnic community-based organizations, but also the resettlement providers there.
Great. And so sticking with that thread of refugee and immigrant resettlement, Christy, I know the IRC has been doing digital inclusion work pre-pandemic, but I'd still love for you to talk about how, you know, both before the pandemic and during, how you found ways to weave digital inclusion into all kinds of programs, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's, you know, just having broadband access at home. I know you all have done such a great job of that.
Yeah, so we started our digital inclusion programming back in 2017 with an AmeriCorps Vista and myself. So a really small team trying to build capacity and understand the needs. And I think the first place to do that, we started by connecting ourselves to a digital alliance. And in Salt Lake City, we have the Utah Communities Connect, Utah's Digital Alliance, through the libraries and private partnerships and other nonprofits and community-based organizations. And we're able to kind of have the resources to know where to start. And we started small with one-on-one training with volunteers, but realizing how to have that sustainability in your program, you do need to integrate it. And it can't be a siloed standalone piece of programming that is kind of it has to be non-negotiable. And so the way our office strategized that is we built it into job readiness for all new arrivals. So we work with new refugee arrivals for 2 years of case management. So every family has a caseworker, and then we have different teams: education program, health team program, immigration, job readiness, and economic well-being, and kind of surround that family with programs. And we try to integrate digital inclusion into all key core services provided to that family. So with job readiness, all our job readiness courses had basic digital instruction built into the curriculum for 8 weeks. For the health programs, we started a telehealth branch where we're teaching clients how to use MyChart and access their health records through training with volunteers. Kind of a pandemic approach for weaving into all programs is we started a kind of a hybrid of our volunteer training program called the Tech Mentors into Tech Squad, where we provided virtual, culturally and linguistically appropriate tech support to clients at any time they want it. So what they would do is make a request with their caseworker. Caseworkers would put that request for some type of digital skill or support into a job board. And then we had trained volunteers who would find that job board, call at the time the client was available with an interpreter, and provide that tech support virtually. And that has been an incredible resource to all programs in our office because it's kind of based on when clients need support. And then the other two areas we've integrated is into college and career readiness for refugee youth ages 15 to 18, providing them with skills for college and career readiness. So that could be learning how to fill out an online application, learning how to search for schools, scholarships. And we have partnered with a lot of our tech companies to provide that mentorship and partnership with that. And then the last area for integration has been with entrepreneurs, which you had mentioned, Leanna, working with, we have a food entrepreneurship program with farmers and restaurant owners and chefs, and providing them kind of tailored instruction that their team can enact within program models that work for them on social media, marketing, running a business, and all the digital tools you would need for that. So not really providing that service, but providing the tools and the resources for them to provide that. So that's kind of how we've gone about that in the last 4 years.
Yeah, I like using that concept of non-negotiable, like digital inclusion is a non-negotiable part of our programs. That's really helpful to think about. So I've heard multiple people mention the importance of data and the importance of knowing and understanding what the community needs are in your neighborhood. And so Autumn, I'd love to ask you how your community-based data informs how the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition work gets done, and also has it changed its priorities?
So, I would say, in my opinion, absolutely. I think our approach really influenced the work, and I will kind of give you context that our Digital Equity Coalition started meeting largely focused on K-12, but knowing my place really well, and this is really me giving a ploy to those of you who work at the community level to know that you are the experts in place, especially if you have relationships. And so that work was going on focused on K-12, and I stayed persistent in our place that we really needed to understand what was happening at the household level. As we got ready as an organization of a coalition rather of members to move forward beyond device access for K-12 students, the type of data that I was looking at really began to be center stage, that we needed to be talking to people, we needed to be leveraging the city's Esri data. I happen to think we have one of the smartest city CIOs and county level CIO, because I've never been in a meeting with the CIO, God bless all of you who are probably attendees here, who were using maps and Esri data and using the layers of who lives in a place, what their income is like, where the closest schools and institutions are. And for me at the neighborhood level, I did that for my neighborhood first, and it absolutely informed how our city and our county decided to fund pilot projects across our community. So we are now at a place where, as a coalition, as we think about piloting new technologies in our community, we're looking at it neighborhood by neighborhood. Angela certainly could attest, and others who participated, that I was a lone drum for a minute there. Like, we need to try to solve this big, but what we recognize is that people live their lives in these neighborhoods, and frankly, the ISP access is very different neighborhood to neighborhood. And so here in Franklin County, we're really leveraging kind of that really place-based data to inform our work. I think the other thing about taking that approach is you can measure it over time. If you have a defined geography, you can see, in and out, right? Just net adoption, net digital skill. You can continue to leverage, again, those trusted brokers and those networks of families in one place, as opposed to trying to do something in broad strokes. And this is an urgent problem, but I think the ability to have sustainable solutions really does require us to do that very, very localized approach. And then we're sharing, right? So I am not selfish. I don't have pride of ownership at all. So if it's working in my neighborhood, I want another neighborhood to have the same benefit. The other thing about our neighborhood, and the last thing I'll say, is it's a pretty large neighborhood. The rest of the neighborhoods that we're looking at locally are a little smaller, and our neighborhood includes affordable housing. It includes both for sale and other infill types of housing. And so that means there's a diversity of the people there. And so we really are, I think, an excellent case study for us to think about in our region. And so if people are trying, especially our local and municipal government leaders are trying to figure out where to start, try to find that sweet spot neighborhood that may be something that is easily replicated across the community, but also give recognition that every neighborhood is different. And again, focusing on the household, right? So not so much what the use is for K-12, but I say internet is a platform for life. And so I'll say from Ohio State's perspective, sorry I said the last thing, but one more thing I want to mention is prior to the pandemic, we did less than 50 telehealth visits a month. Today, we do over 3,000. And that means that we had to ramp up the way we were engaging with our patients about it. Some state policy had to change to make that more accessible to people. But what we know now is our patients can't use that resource if they don't know how to use it. So going back to that three-legged stool, it matters for every dimension of life, being able to work from home, take classes. And my personal favorite is just social connection and enjoyment. Watching Netflix, there's nothing wrong with that, especially when you're in a stay-at-home order, but recognizing that the internet is literally a world wide web of access of information and connections, especially again in a pandemic. So absolutely, our work is being replicated, at least in our region, that we're looking at it neighborhood by neighborhood. We've now extended our conversation to be across our county and different municipalities. So we're talking with other local governments. Our county seat is Columbus, but there are other suburbs that are very much interested in thinking about this access issue and how we do that collectively across the region. So I'm very optimistic that my little neighborhood-based work is really going to be a case study for us to replicate.
Yeah, it sounds like it's already a case study to replicate. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that it's not just about collecting the data and knowing the data and identifying the gaps, but also about continuing to use data to measure. Because it's so easy to get that baseline and then like, okay, we're going to do these things without necessarily coming back and saying, and are we actually improving quality of life, or are we actually addressing the concerns that folks have? So I really appreciate that about the approach that you all are using. And so sticking with the data, you're also big into data, and I know you're doing some research on using digital tools to support the education of immigrant origin youth. So I'm curious if there's any preliminary findings that you're able to share with us, and also any policy implications that it might point us towards.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share about our current work. And before I do, I just wanted to comment on some of the points that Autumn raised, specifically the idea that, you know, digital access really impacts every area of life. And that it was the big aha for us as well. And the reason that we started this research, particularly looking at youth who have immigrant backgrounds or are immigrants themselves. You know, they just arrived to the US, they don't have friends at school. Their social connection, like any other teenager, is going to be through online access, social media, what have you. And if they don't have the digital skills, that's not going to be available. On top of that, access to homework assignments, school class instruction, and so forth. We just saw how much youth were impacted, even as their parents lost work because their work was in person, and now youth were stepping up to earn money for their households. So as we looked at the impacts on youth, we were specifically interested in children who are between 15 and 24, so children with air quotes, young youth and young adults, who have at least one immigrant parent or are immigrants themselves. And we wanted to identify promising practices for digital literacy and access. We also wanted to assess the impact on educational attainment for these youth who have digital access and those who don't. So it's a mixed method study, and the quantitative side of our work looks at census data, which, as many of you probably know, recently started gathering data on which households have access to devices and which ones have access to affordable broadband. And so through all of that work, we compared three groups of people: immigrants, youth who have immigrant parents, and US-born youth. We thought that the greatest disparity would be between the immigrant youth and US-born youth, but we found, at least on a preliminary basis, we're still crossing our T's and dotting our I's, that there seems to be a large difference between access levels for children of immigrants compared to immigrants themselves. And that might sound a bit wonky, they sound like they're very related or similar groups, but this could have significant implications for the policy recommendations that we come up with, because now we're getting down to the weeds about which groups are most impacted and which groups would need the resources most. And we're also curious about why children of immigrants might have more access to computers and broadband than even some US-born youth.
Those are some really interesting questions that you're posing, and I can't wait to hear when the final results come out. Is there any kind of timeline for that?
Just like renovations, research always takes longer than planned, but we're thinking sometime this fall or winter.
Okay, great. Looking forward to that. So another big topic, I think, in addition to data in the digital inclusion space is funding. We all know how hard it can be to come by. And so we all know that for digital inclusion, that can sometimes be, not sometimes, often be an uphill battle. And so I think that some folks have succeeded in tying digital inclusion to other, quote, more fundable areas, whether that's workforce development, whether that's refugee resettlement, whether it's education. So I'd love to hear what approaches you all have found successful in securing funding for digital inclusion related programs. So Christy, let's start with you.
My first strategy with this was talking with other program managers within my office and finding out what their goals were and what their digital inclusion needs were for the programs that they were running. And then having those conversations, starting to collaborate and brainstorm, and looking at our theories of change and our log models and our program development plans and designs, and wherever there was a space to integrate digital inclusion or the education team could support that, building those into that strategy, and then also building those into the budgets when they would send out grants or funding requests. And so that digital inclusion was built into so many programs' budgets after a year of this strategy that you almost were just kind of seeing funds come in and implementing your same program, which was designed to be integrated and to be an essential, like non-negotiable program within the office. And so that's the strategy I took early on. It's taken a little bit of snowballing to get it going because you have to start small and then build. And again, I did start with Vistas, which made a little bit easier for time and effort funds. Like you can focus more on the activities and the service. And then kind of that time and effort comes when you have more and more of those small snowball funding streams. Another approach is we live in Salt Lake City, which is becoming a tech hub. We have the Silicon Slopes. So if you like to ski and you're in the tech industry, come to Salt Lake City because that's where we have this booming tech industry happening. So accessing those companies and tech companies and different corporations to utilize some of their social responsibility, time and effort and funds, and incorporating those back into tech training for young people. So looking at how do you build career readiness for that 15 to 24-year-old SA gap of students, and helping them know what careers exist out there in the tech industry and how to connect them with those partners, and then also see if there's funding streams that can support that work. So that's kind of our big strategy. I also just wanted to just mention, SA, I was meeting with one of your research assistants last month. I think I'm going to be in your research. We had a great conversation about refugee youth and digital inclusion. So I'm really excited to read the findings of that study.
Yeah, I like that approach, Christy, of making the integration so that digital inclusion components are just in every program, and all of your program staff have bought into that being a part of their programs. I'm going to pass it over to Essay and Autumn for the same question, but first, I want to read a question that came in because I think it's on this topic and perhaps we can address it as we talk about funding. So Kelly, who's in rural upstate New York, was asking about whether anyone has had success with grants for broadband mapping kinds of projects, and if there's any resources that folks can recommend that offer grant funding for digital equity. So Essay, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Liana. And Christy, thank you for participating in our research study. Lily shared the interview, so we're really excited to put all of that together in our analysis. You know, in terms of finding funding to support digital equity work, I agree with the integrated approach. In refugee resettlement, our effort is to help refugees build successful lives in the US holistically. And so we're accustomed to tying into different sectors, whether it's economics or education or health or what have you, because all of those pieces tie into having a successful life here in the US. I think digital equity has become just another one of those sectors that are clearly tied to resettling. And there's no turning back. You know, the pandemic really brought it to light more than ever before. But even as there's light at the end of the tunnel, the world, you know, I don't think our country is going back to the pre-pandemic days. So it's really important that we continue to frame digital equity as a support service in the same way that childcare and transportation are for accessing jobs and social services. So that's been our approach to things. And I would say for the participant who asked about specific funding ideas, in my experience, and others may have different experiences and views, data is so key. That mapping piece is so important. And a lot of big funders like federal governments or national foundations may not want to fund that kind of work. And so in my experience, it's easier to tap into community foundations or other local philanthropic or even commercial groups. A lot of banks want to fund these kinds of projects so that you can have the mapping and the data and then go to the bigger funders at the national or federal level.
I would agree with Essay's comment. We were pretty fortunate for our mapping and survey work. Two things. One, our local governments combined and put together a competitive pool of funding using CARES Act dollars. So we certainly leveraged the opportunity. And of course, there are more federal dollars that are coming into our community. So being prepared for that moment helped us. But I think what really helped us is that we had already been doing this work for 10 years. So we knew our neighborhood again very well. And so I could easily go to a funder and say, this is the demographic, this is the number of households, you know, income levels, and make some educated guesses that would lead us to the path of needing a more specific map and survey project. The other thing, we were very fortunate to receive funds from our local community foundation. So the Columbus Foundation here actually set up a digital divide fund that still exists, is still standing, and I have no reason to think it's going to go away. And so really looking at your local community foundation, I think is excellent advice, but local and state government here in Ohio have set up funds to really support some of this work. So it may take a little bit of due diligence. And then the other thing, just recognizing my relationship with healthcare, is payers and healthcare related foundations and even organizations have a vested interest in better understanding their patient population, particularly those who are Medicaid patients, for example. And so there could be funding opportunities. I think someone put in the chat that if you build it, they will come. And I will say that's absolutely the testimony for us. I repurposed dollars that I was going to use for the workforce events to help initiate some of this work, believing very intentionally that we needed to pay people to go door to door. We also, like Christy, embedded it into an existing program. So we facilitate for Ohio State's College of Nursing a community health worker training, and adding modules for community health workers to be trained in this space allowed us to leverage funding that we had for that program to really expand what I hope will become a little army of digital navigators who are also helping people navigate specifically around their health. And so definitely don't leave any rock unturned, and don't wait to get started. There are some things you can do, like putting out a survey to your constituency that may be low to no cost. But in terms of our ability, we've given away over 500 devices to people in our community. That was because we leveraged the moment of the pandemic, and we were able to capture some CARES Act dollars. The learning of our local government of leveraging the CARES Act dollars is maybe there should be a permanent fund that they share, that they put together these funding opportunities. So when things are working well, making sure you're sharing that feedback, and not being facetious at all. But I think it's important for our elected officials to hear gratitude for the way they have been, I think, very targeted in leveraging those dollars. So payers, again, no rock unturned, I think. And other existing funders that you work with, probably banks have an interest in this as well. So.
Yeah, I'm hearing a few common threads, I think, between the panelists and in the chat as well. So one being, start small, just pilot whatever you can, and hopefully they important work. Get buy-in from either trusted community organizations, internally, your colleagues, everyone, the CIO, whoever it needs to be, get buy-in, and your community, obviously, that's a key part of it. And then make sure that digital inclusion is a non-negotiable support service, and that's the way we need to talk about it. So continuing with the theme of how the integration of digital inclusion makes these programs really much more sustainable long term, because we've talked about how priorities oftentimes shift, siloed programs get the boot, and then we will say this is not mission aligned and we refocus. I'd love to hear from Kate how integrating digital inclusion into existing programs has contributed to what you see as the long-term sustainability of this work.
So I want to roll it back a little bit, because I think my experience for the Senior Community Service Employment Program is a little different. And I'll start with the first one. Is our program is continuing to send packets by mail, training packets by mail. This is probably the oldest form of distance learning that has been used in the past, and it still is effective. So our data collection was really asking our participants, almost 700, access, what is your tool, what is your competency? And so we really did, and basically it was every 2 weeks we were talking to people and doing surveys on our current participants. So on the equity equation, it was impossible for us to do anything digitally, and we find ourselves advancing some and not all, which is the whole purpose of our program, is to advance all. But what was different, I think, than some other folks have talked about, is my program is out of the Department of Labor. We started in 1965 under the Older Americans Act. We're the kissing cousin, so to speak, of WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So we're a different body of funds from a different source, but still managed by the Department of Labor. The reason I bring this up is that when I talked about digital divide, this was not a term known in the Department of Labor. So during the crisis, we had, all of our federal project officers were calling folks, grantees, and saying, how are you doing? What are you doing? And for us, we said there's no other way for us to be able to pay people than send these packets. And one solution, well, why can't you get people to get, computers? And what about the libraries? And because you can imagine on the federal level, some states were still open. Some libraries were still open. Ohio, we shut down. The governor closed us down March 16th. I'll never forget it. And suddenly we all became like curriculum developers. But the reason that I bring this up is because we're making the assumption similar to, there were lots of assumption in workforce development that there were these third spots that were always available for people to go out to the library and get assistance. Well, now there's another third spot, another assumption is that our funders are aware of what the issue is. And the digital divide was not a term that was understood. I know in workforce development, we're generally focused on incremental individual competency development. Do you know how to use Word? Do you know how to, sign in for an email? Those types of things, very incremental. But from the macro perspective, if your funder isn't fully aware of the dialogue that maybe many of us are having in an echo chamber, we're all convinced, it's like, yep, we know this would solve everything. But if our funder of billions is not aware that this is an issue, then we have to really backtrack and realize that there are three, we talk about, for some reason, everything comes in threes. All great things come in threes for me. But the other third stool is really to look at awareness building, educating funders, and helping them implement really effective strategies that that can better serve the constituents they're hoping to serve. And for us, it was when I say that necessity kind of was the mother of invention for us, the first conversation about digital divide in Region 5 in Department of Labor was based on hearing us talk about that we were mailing packets. People were using the internet and saying, hey, here's some free online tools. Well, if you don't have free online tools, again, here in the world of ageism, it's the last ism that is openly, you're allowed to say what old people can't do. Oh, they don't know how to use the internet. Oh, they can barely use their television. And so now we have this, so imagine a funder that might not be aware that these anemic solutions on digital inclusion, like go to the library and get your workforce training. Hope a librarian can do it. And maybe you can get an appointment at the resource room at your workforce development and community center. But that, again, it really shows how we're keeping at least older Americans behind structurally on ageism because we're not providing the most basic solutions. Imagine the entire world was changed by K-12 when kids couldn't go to school. It was the Titanic turned on a dime. But for the older worker, the idea that this is really an issue for them, Autumn brought up telehealth, Essie and Christy brought up, the challenges for newly arrived Americans and their families. But for the older worker, the discussion has not really advanced that much. So the reason I bring it up, and all of you are dealing with my population. All of you are dealing with someone 55 and older in your population. The New York Times just wrote a fascinating article, I think it was like April 30th, but that in the human population, we have doubled life expectancy in 100 years. So that means the worker is working longer. So everybody has this old vision of a 65-year-old that is retiring. There's no pension in America that's still available for the standard middle class. Those are things all gone. So to me, I wanted to just bring up a notion on sustainable funding is educate your funder. If they don't know it's an issue, then you're just trying to tweak narrative to fit into their, square into the, the circle and the square, box. And we really had to change that to say that this is an issue, we're dealing with the issue, but if you don't know the issue, one element, what's said about the digital divide? is it the same thing as the Northwest Passage? Same thing? And I'm like, well, kinda, it is that difficult, but it gives you a sense of how new the term was for a funder that's dealing in billions of dollars.
Yeah, I think I appreciate you bringing up that point. It's not just about making our programs fit funding priorities. It's also about advocating for digital inclusion in front of funders, no matter how difficult that might be, but creating the space so that digital inclusion programs can sometimes be just digital inclusion programs without trying to, fit that round peg in the square hole like you were talking about. So Christy, I'd love to have you talk about how that integration of digital inclusion into other programs you feel like helps with the overall long-term sustainability.
Yeah, I think obvious for us is the funding. So if it is built into other programs, you have kind of these increased funding streams that you can pull from. For me, it's been being able to hire a full-time digital inclusion coordinator. So having that staff member oversee digital inclusion integration and being part of either digital alliances in our local context, knowing the population, being connected with other nonprofits doing similar work. We have a very strong connection with the school district since we do programming and school enrollment. So knowing what's happening, having a pulse on what's happening at community centers with the school has created sustainability because we know what's coming and where the needs are. And we have a lot of trust with our clients. And so helping them know where resources exist and kind of leveraging those connection points. So funding, having full-time staff in these positions, and then having the right connections in your community and knowing what the needs are before they are kind of known to everybody. I think being on the ground, like boots on the ground, Autumn, and knowing your communities, what you've mentioned, I feel like we have kind of this fortune telling ability to know what's coming and what the bigger issues are. And also educating funders is huge. Every time we have conversations about job readiness, about career development, about youth engagement, digital inclusion is always connected with those conversations. So it's, again, not isolated, but integrated.
Yeah, and it's great to also hear you talk about capacity, because we do need that staff capacity and that long-term investment in staff capacity and staff development to continue implementing those digital inclusion programs and to understand why it's so relevant, even if their specific program might not initially feel connected to that particular scope of work. So we have one final bonus round, which all the panels are going to participate in, and Angela has set the rule that you get one sentence to respond to this. So the question is, between the nearly $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act and the bold amounts earmarked for broadband by House leaders for the upcoming infrastructure bills, large amounts of money are intended to improve internet access. Large amounts of money intended to improve internet access are moving towards state and local governments. So in this final speed round, give us one sentence on how you are preparing for this influx of money. Let's start with Autumn.
I knew you were going to start with me, and I don't have one sentence. I guess how we're preparing for this round of money is leveraging the collaboration of more than 30 organizations that includes our Franklin County and City of Columbus technology leaders to make sure we create something that's a regional approach and serves both household level access and municipal government use. That probably wasn't a sentence, but thank you.
I think we can accept it. Kate.
I think the expanding the continuum of engagement on what digital inclusion programs actually are. I forget who spoke, I think it might have been you, Christy, but it's after someone goes through a training program, how do they become advocates and assist others, like an alumni association? So I'm looking at those that go through our program being people that help new ones coming into the new digital world. But how do we financially support efforts like that? So that's what I'm looking at, the continuum of programming that really scaffolds a larger infrastructure to better support efforts, and they're not the one and done that funders are used to funding. Much longer than one sentence.
It's okay. It was Angela's rule, not mine, so we can. Essay.
In a nutshell, we're connecting people with information and decision makers.
Way to set the bar for short and concise. Christy.
I think advocacy and having those voices going up and leading up, but then also having the systems to be able to scale programs on the ground.
Great. So I'm going to switch us over to the Q&A. I see Donna typed in a question earlier. I think this is probably more geared towards Autumn, but I'd invite anyone who wants to chime in on this, who participate. Donna's question is, should local governments be hiring consultants to determine broadband accessibility or use community navigators to poll and survey neighbors? And how long should it take to determine need versus meeting the need?
So I would answer that they could do both. It depends on what their knowledge is already of their local marketplace. I'm not a huge fan always, no offense to folks in the space, of bringing a national consultant into your local community, because you probably have the knowledge there. You just need to determine who's already thinking and working on this. Maybe your regional planning commission, may even be your library network, municipal CIOs. We happen to have a couple smart ones here in Central Ohio. But I do think leveraging community navigators, particularly those who can survey in the community where they already live, would be really important, because there's nuance to the way people may answer some of these questions. If you say, do you have access to the internet, and you say a yes or no question like the census, you may get yes and it's not really yes. And so you want to make sure both competency in different languages that are spoken, but even cultural competency around what that access would mean. And some people are just generally distrustful of strangers, right? And just being honest that you want your surveyors and your navigators, in my opinion, to look like or already be in service to the community that they're engaging. I do think, and this is me, is time is worth paying for. So we did not ask people to go survey for free. We did make very clear that we wanted to pay them. And while we did receive some funding, our funding didn't cover the cost, but we still stayed committed that we would take money out of our budget to honor the fact that people were going door to door to question. So I absolutely would say yes. That data, to Essay's point, research, listen, I want to publish the survey part. We've since gotten a total of like 800 and some respondents to our survey. We've kept going because we didn't initially hit our neighborhood, but that data absolutely informs every conversation I have with a policymaker or a potential funder. So I think it's worth its weight in gold. The other thing too is when you're surveying the community, you're also educating them while you're talking to them. And I really take seriously the responsibility of me as an organization, our organization, to educate the lay public. I'm not trying to solve the problem for you, and it's not patriarchal. It's a collaboration so that you know how to make a decision for your family, and we're sharing the information with you and not just chasing dollars to, be effective. Both are important, but I think there's lots of benefits to doing that navigation route.
Yeah, and if I could add just 2 quick points, one about the consultant role and the other about data versus doing. So in different areas of my life, I wear the consultant role. So I'm speaking with that in mind. Consultants are great. They provide immediate expertise where it's needed. At the same time, with regard to sustainability, sometimes organizations think that consultant will come and fix it, and then the funding runs dry for the consultant, and what happens? So I would say leverage the consultant, but make sure that the organization is building a sustainable plan with internal resources so that it doesn't die when the consultant leaves. And then the second piece about data, you know, I, of course, value research, value data and evidence. At the same time, when there are pressing real life needs, I don't think it's prudent to wait for the research or wait for the data. You can build the plane as you fly it based on what you know, and then tweak it as you get more data and evidence.
Anyone else have anything to add on that question? All right. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. So I'm going to pass it over to Angela.
Thank you, Liana. Well, this was fabulous. I really, really love when we have all female panels, and you all were a rock star panel today. So big thank you to you all for being here. For those who are new to NDIA, we are a community of all the folks that you just heard from, and we welcome you into the community because this is how we learn, is from each other, right? So Miles will stick our join link in the chat for those who aren't already members of NDIA, so we welcome you. We do have more webinars left, so Wednesdays, 1 o'clock Eastern, and of course this recording will be available very shortly. Huge thank you to our panelists for joining us here today, and Kate, I'm glad your connection came through. So thank you everyone, and have a great Wednesday.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.